The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as King Charles adjusted his reading glasses and looked up from his daily papers. At 75, he had grown accustomed to the weight of the crown, but today something felt different. The castle seemed quieter than usual, and he noticed Camilla had barely touched her breakfast before excusing herself to tend to her gardens. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, arrived precisely at 10 o'clock for their scheduled meeting about the upcoming charity gala. She knocked gently on the study door, her warm smile immediately brightening the room as she entered. Charles had always admired his daughter-in-law's grace, but lately, he found himself looking forward to these meetings more than he cared to admit. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Catherine said, settling into the chair across from his mahogany desk. She wore a simple navy dress that somehow managed to look both elegant and approachable. Her genuine interest in royal duties had never gone unnoticed by Charles, who had spent decades hoping someone in the family would share his passion for service. As they discussed the details of the charity event, Charles found himself captivated by Catherine's thoughtful suggestions. She spoke passionately about creating programs that would genuinely help struggling families, not just generate positive headlines. Her eyes lit up when she described her vision for connecting with real people facing real problems. "I believe we can make a real difference," Catherine said, leaning forward slightly. "Not just write checks, but actually understand what people need." Charles nodded, remembering his own early struggles, to convince the family that modern royalty needed to be more than ceremonial figures. Their conversation flowed naturally from charity work to shared concerns about William's heavy schedule and the children's education. Charles appreciated how Catherine never complained about the pressures of royal life, instead focusing on solutions and positive outcomes. She reminded him of his younger self, full of idealistic hopes for making the monarchy relevant and meaningful. Meanwhile, Camilla spent the morning in her private garden, pulling weeds with more force than necessary. She had noticed the change in her husband's demeanor over the past few months. The way his face brightened when Catherine entered a room, the extra attention he paid when his daughter-in-law spoke, the lengthening of their private meetings. The Queen Consort had always prided herself on being practical and realistic about relationships. She understood that affection could shift and change, especially in a family as complex as the royals. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally were two very different things. As she worked in the soil, Camilla reflected on her own journey to acceptance within the royal family. It had taken decades for the public to warm to her, and even longer for some family members to truly embrace her presence. Now at 76, she wondered if she was slowly being replaced by someone younger, more vibrant, and certainly more beloved by the people. The afternoon brought a family lunch where Charles's attention seemed entirely focused on Catherine's stories about the children's school activities. He laughed heartily at her descriptions of Louis's latest mischievous adventures and asked detailed questions about Charlotte's horse-riding lessons. Camilla noticed how his eyes rarely left Catherine's face during these conversations. When Catherine excused herself to make a phone call to William, Charles's gaze followed her out of the room. The silence that followed felt heavy to Camilla, who had grown skilled at reading the subtle shifts in royal family dynamics over her many years of navigating them. That evening, as Charles reviewed his schedule for the following week, he found himself specifically looking for opportunities to spend more time with Catherine. Her fresh perspective on royal duties energized him in a way he hadn't felt in years. She represented everything he hoped the monarchy could become: connected, compassionate, and genuinely useful to society. Camilla, meanwhile, retreated to her private sitting room earlier than usual. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled into her favorite chair, trying to process the growing distance she felt from her husband. The man who had once hung on her every word now seemed distracted during their conversations, his mind clearly elsewhere. The palace staff had begun to notice the subtle changes, too. Charles's private secretary mentioned scheduling more meetings with the Princess of Wales, while Camilla's social secretary noted several canceled engagements as the Queen Consort chose to spend more time alone. As the day ended, Charles found himself thinking about his conversation with Catherine while Camilla sat silently beside him, both lost in their own thoughts. The foundation of their relationship, built on decades of shared experiences and mutual support, was beginning to show small cracks that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. The royal household continued its daily routines, but something fundamental had shifted. Charles had found in Catherine not just a dutiful daughter-in-law, but a kindred spirit who shared his vision for the future of the monarchy. Meanwhile, Camilla sensed that her position as her husband's closest confidant was slowly but surely being challenged by someone she had always considered an ally. Neither spoke of these changes openly, but both felt the subtle transformation taking place within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. The stage was set for a quiet drama that would unfold over the coming months, testing relationships that had seemed unshakable and revealing the complex emotions that even royalty cannot escape. The evening shadows grew longer as Charles made a mental note to invite Catherine for tea the following week, while Camilla wondered if her husband would even notice if she didn't join them for dinner tomorrow night. The following week brought an unexpected invitation that would change everything. Charles had decided to ask Catherine to accompany him on a private visit to one of his favorite charities, a small organization supporting elderly people in rural communities. He told himself it was simply practical. William was away on official duties, and Catherine's presence would bring valuable media attention to the cause. Catherine accepted immediately, her enthusiasm genuine and infectious. As their car wound through the countryside toward the charity's headquarters, Charles found himself sharing stories from his early days as Prince of Wales. When he had first discovered his passion for environmental and social causes, Catherine listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed she truly understood his vision. "I remember feeling so frustrated," Charles confided as they approached their destination. "Everyone wanted me to just cut ribbons and smile for photographs, but I knew we could do so much more." Catherine nodded, sharing her own struggles with finding meaningful ways to use her platform beyond fashion commentary and photo opportunities. At the charity center, Charles watched with growing admiration as Catherine connected effortlessly with the elderly residents. She sat on worn sofas, holding wrinkled hands while listening to stories of wartime experiences and family memories. Her genuine interest wasn't performed for cameras. There were no photographers present, just two royals spending time with people who rarely received such attention. One elderly woman named Margaret pulled Catherine aside and whispered, "You remind me of my granddaughter. She has your kind eyes." Charles overheard the comment and felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was exactly the kind of authentic connection he had always hoped the royal family could make with ordinary people. During lunch at a simple local pub, Charles and Catherine talked for hours about their shared vision for modernizing royal charitable work. They discussed creating programs that would provide ongoing support rather than one-time visits, developing partnerships with local organizations, and finding ways to address root causes of social problems rather than just offering temporary relief. "You understand what I've been trying to do for decades," Charles said quietly, his voice filled with an emotion he didn't quite recognize. Catherine smiled, touched by his trust in sharing his deeper thoughts and aspirations with her. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Camilla spent the day dealing with a growing sense of unease. She had not been invited on the charity visit, despite having supported many of Charles's causes throughout their marriage. His private secretary had simply mentioned that His Majesty thought a smaller group would be more appropriate for this particular visit. Camilla tried to dismiss her concerns, focusing instead on her own charitable commitments. She attended a literacy program at a local school, but found herself distracted and less engaged than usual. The children's excited chatter couldn't quite drown out her worried thoughts about what was happening between her husband and Catherine. That evening, Charles returned to the palace energized and talkative in a way Camilla hadn't seen in months. Over dinner, he regaled her with stories from the day, praising Catherine's natural ability to connect with people and her innovative ideas for expanding their charitable reach. "She really gets it, Camilla," Charles said, cutting his lamb with more enthusiasm than he typically showed for food. "Catherine understands that we can't just be figureheads anymore. We need to be catalysts for real change." Camilla nodded politely, but noticed that every other sentence began with, "Catherine thinks" or "Catherine suggested." As the weeks progressed, the pattern continued. Charles found excuses to involve Catherine in more of his projects, seeking her input on everything from environmental initiatives to educational programs. Their meetings grew longer and more frequent, often extending through lunch as they discussed their shared passions and dreams for the monarchy's future. Catherine, for her part, felt genuinely energized by these collaborations. She had always admired Charles's dedication to causes others dismissed as boring or outdated. Working closely with him gave her insights into the depth of his commitment and the loneliness he had often felt in pursuing unpopular but important issues. During one particularly meaningful conversation about urban farming initiatives, Catherine reached across the table and briefly touched Charles's hand while making a point about community gardens. The gesture was innocent, supportive, and entirely appropriate, but both felt a spark of connection that went beyond their official relationship. Charles began looking forward to these meetings with an anticipation that surprised him. Catherine's presence brought light and energy to discussions that had grown routine over the years. Her fresh perspective challenged him to think differently about problems he had been grappling with for decades. The palace staff noticed the king's improved mood and increased productivity. His private secretary mentioned to colleagues that His Majesty seemed more engaged with his duties than he had been since the coronation. What they didn't mention was how often Catherine's name appeared in his daily schedule. Camilla, meanwhile, found herself increasingly isolated from her husband's most important work. Charles would share general updates about his activities, but the detailed planning sessions and passionate discussions now happened with Catherine. The Queen Consort began spending more time in her private quarters, reading extensively and tending to her correspondence with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Friends who had known Camilla for decades began to notice subtle changes in her demeanor. She seemed more guarded in conversations, less likely to share amusing anecdotes about royal life, and more prone to changing the subject when Charles's activities came up in discussion. One evening, as Charles enthusiastically described a new educational initiative he and Catherine were developing, Camilla quietly excused herself and went to bed early. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering how the woman who had once been her strongest supporter in the family had unknowingly become her replacement in her husband's affections. The irony wasn't lost on her. Catherine had always been kind, respectful, and supportive of Camilla's role in the family. There was no malice or calculation in the growing bond between Catherine and Charles, which somehow made it even more painful to witness. As autumn approached, the dynamic within the royal household had fundamentally shifted. Charles had found in Catherine not just a collaborator, but someone who truly understood and shared his deepest convictions about service and duty. For the first time in years, he felt understood and appreciated for who he truly was, rather than simply what his position required him to be. October brought an unseasonably warm spell to London, but inside the royal residences, a different kind of climate change was taking place. Charles had begun asking Catherine to accompany him to increasingly important events, always with perfectly reasonable explanations that masked the deeper truth of his growing dependence on her presence. The turning point came during a state dinner for the President of France. Protocol dictated that Camilla would sit beside Charles as Queen Consort, but he specifically requested that Catherine be seated nearby so they could discuss a joint environmental initiative they were planning. Throughout the evening, Charles found himself turning to Catherine for her thoughts on various topics. Often in the middle of conversations with other dignitaries, Catherine handled the attention gracefully, always redirecting credit back to Charles and ensuring that Camilla remained included in discussions. But observers couldn't help but notice the king's obvious preference for his daughter-in-law's company. Foreign diplomats whispered among themselves about the unusual dynamic they were witnessing. Ambassador Philippe Dubois from France mentioned to his wife later that evening, "There was something quite touching about the way the king looked at the Princess of Wales when she spoke. Not romantic, you understand, but like a father discovering his child shares his deepest passions." His wife had noticed too, along with the Queen Consort's increasingly strained smile as the evening progressed. After the dinner, Charles invited Catherine to his private study for a nightcap and further discussion about their environmental project. They talked until nearly midnight, sharing ideas and building on each other's suggestions with an intellectual intimacy that both found deeply satisfying. Catherine felt valued for her mind and insights, while Charles experienced the joy of finding someone who truly understood his vision. Camilla had retired earlier, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. As she prepared for bed, She could hear the distant sound of animated conversation and occasional laughter coming from Charles's study. The queen consort sat at her dressing table, removing her jewelry with mechanical precision while processing the evening's events. She thought about her conversation with Princess Anne from the previous week. Charles's sister had always been direct in her observations about family dynamics. "Charles seems quite energized lately," Anne had mentioned casually. "Catherine's influence, I suspect. It's rather sweet, actually, watching him come alive again around someone who shares his interests." Anne's comment had been innocent enough, but it confirmed what Camilla had been sensing for months. Her husband wasn't just working more closely with Catherine. He was becoming emotionally dependent on her presence and approval in ways that had once been reserved for their private relationship. The next morning brought an unexpected crisis that would further cement the bond between Charles and Catherine. News broke of a major industrial accident in Wales that had affected several rural communities Charles had championed for years. His immediate instinct was to visit the area personally, but his security team worried about the logistics of such a rapid response. Catherine, who had been meeting with Charles about a completely different matter when the news arrived, immediately volunteered to help coordinate the visit. She spent the entire morning making phone calls to local officials, organizing relief efforts, and working with the palace press office to ensure media coverage would focus on the victims rather than royal protocol. Watching Catherine take charge with such efficiency and compassion, Charles felt a surge of gratitude and admiration that surprised him with its intensity. Here was someone who didn't just understand his values, but actively embodied them when action was needed. She anticipated his concerns and addressed them before he even had to ask. When they arrived in Wales together that afternoon, Charles witnessed Catherine's remarkable ability to provide comfort to grieving families, while simultaneously gathering information about their practical needs. She knelt on muddy ground to speak with children, held the hands of elderly residents who had lost their homes, and took detailed notes about necessary follow-up support. "She's a natural," Charles confided to his private secretary during a brief moment alone. "I've never seen anyone connect with people so authentically while also maintaining the dignity the office requires." His aide nodded, having made similar observations about the Princess of Wales over the past several months. That evening, after returning from Wales, Charles and Catherine debriefed in his study over simple sandwiches and tea. They were both emotionally drained from witnessing so much suffering, but energized by their ability to provide meaningful help. Their conversation was punctuated by comfortable silences as they processed the day's experiences. "Thank you," Charles said quietly as Catherine prepared to leave. "I couldn't have managed today without your support." Catherine smiled, touched by his gratitude, but also aware that something significant was happening between them that neither fully understood. Meanwhile, Camilla had spent the day attending a routine charity luncheon, going through the motions of royal duty, while her thoughts remained with her husband and Catherine in Wales. She watched the evening news coverage and saw the obvious chemistry between them. Not romantic, but something deeper and more concerning. Genuine intellectual and emotional partnership. The following weeks brought a series of similar collaborations. Charles began consulting Catherine on matters he had previously discussed only with his closest advisors. Her opinions carried weight in decisions about everything from charitable priorities to public statements on environmental issues. Palace staff noticed that the king's mood had become directly linked to his interactions with Catherine. Days when they worked together were marked by energy and enthusiasm. Days when Catherine was occupied with her own duties or family responsibilities found Charles noticeably deflated and distracted. Camilla, observing these patterns with growing concern, made a decision that would prove pivotal. Instead of confronting the situation directly, she began gradually withdrawing from her husband's professional life. She declined invitations to events where Catherine would be present, begged off from planning sessions that might involve lengthy discussions of shared interests, and started spending more time with her own family and friends. This withdrawal, intended as self-protection, had the unintended consequence of creating even more space for Charles and Catherine's relationship to deepen. With Camilla less present, Charles naturally turned more frequently to Catherine for the intellectual and emotional support he craved. One evening in late October, as autumn rain pelted the windows of Windsor Castle, Charles realized he had spent the entire day looking forward to his scheduled meeting with Catherine the following morning. The recognition troubled him, but not enough to change his behavior. For the first time in years, he felt truly understood and appreciated, and he wasn't ready to give up that feeling. Camilla, meanwhile, had begun keeping a private journal, something she hadn't done since her youth. In careful handwriting, she documented her growing sense of isolation and the gradual shift in her marriage's emotional landscape. She wrote not from anger or jealousy, but from a deep sadness about losing the special connection she had once shared with the man who had waited decades to marry her. November arrived with an early frost that seemed to mirror the growing chill in the royal household. Charles had become so accustomed to Catherine's presence in his daily routine that he barely noticed how their relationship had evolved beyond professional collaboration into something resembling emotional dependency. The realization hit him during a quiet Sunday afternoon when Catherine had gone to Sandringham with William and the children for a family weekend. Charles found himself wandering the halls of Windsor Castle, unable to concentrate on his usual activities. He picked up books without reading them, started letters he didn't finish, and checked his watch repeatedly as if Catherine might suddenly appear for a meeting that didn't exist. His restlessness didn't go unnoticed by Camilla, who had been observing her husband's behavior with growing clarity. She found him in his study, staring out the window at the bare November gardens with an expression of obvious longing. For the first time in months, she decided to address the elephant in the room directly. "You miss her," Camilla said quietly, settling into the chair across from his desk. It wasn't a question. Charles turned from the window, startled by both her presence and her directness. For a moment, he considered denying what they both knew to be true. "Catherine brings a fresh perspective to our work," Charles replied carefully, but Camilla's knowing look made further pretense impossible. "Yes," he admitted. "I miss her company." "Is that so wrong?" Camilla studied her husband's face, seeing vulnerability there that reminded her of the younger man she had fallen in love with decades earlier. "It's not wrong to appreciate her dedication," she said slowly. "But Charles, you light up around her in ways you haven't with me in years. I'd have to be blind not to see it." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared in their marriage. Charles, perhaps for the first time, tried to articulate what Catherine's presence meant to him. She understood his vision for the monarchy's future, shared his passion for environmental and social causes, and brought energy to work that had become routine and sometimes burdensome. "It's not about you, Camilla," Charles said, reaching across the desk to touch her hand. "Catherine makes me feel useful again, like the work we do actually matters. With her, I remember why I wanted to be king in the first place." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they cut deeply. Camilla withdrew her hand gently. "But it is about me, Charles. When you share your most important thoughts and dreams with someone else, when you prefer her company to mine, when your whole demeanor changes in her presence, that affects our marriage whether you intend it or not." That evening, Charles sat alone in his study long after Camilla had gone to bed. He forced himself to honestly examine his feelings about Catherine. There was nothing inappropriate about their relationship. She was married to his son, and their interactions remained entirely proper. But the emotional intimacy they had developed went far beyond what was necessary for their professional collaboration. He thought about the way Catherine's eyes sparkled when she discussed their shared projects, how her enthusiasm reignited his own passion for causes he had championed for decades. With her, he felt like the man he had always hoped to be, rather than simply the king circumstances had made him. Meanwhile, Camilla lay awake in their shared bedroom, processing their conversation and its implications. She understood that Charles wasn't intentionally choosing Catherine over her, but understanding didn't diminish the pain of watching her husband's affections shift towards someone else. The queen consort had always prided herself on being practical about relationships. She knew that marriages evolved over time, that couples could grow apart even while maintaining love and respect for each other. But knowing something intellectually and living through it emotionally were entirely different experiences. The next morning brought news that would test everyone's emotional strength. William had been injured in a minor riding accident at Sandringham. Nothing serious, but enough to require a brief hospital stay for observation. Catherine called Charles personally to inform him of the situation, her voice strained with worry despite the doctor's reassurances. Without hesitation, Charles immediately made arrangements to travel to Norfolk to be with his son and daughter-in-law. As he prepared to leave, he found himself primarily concerned about Catherine's emotional state rather than William's physical condition. The realization troubled him, but not enough to change his priorities. During the drive to Sandringham, Charles reflected on how naturally he had assumed the role of Catherine's supporter and protector. When had her well-being become so important to his own peace of mind? When had comforting her become more instinctive than comforting his own wife? At the hospital, Charles found Catherine pacing in the family waiting area, her usually perfect composure cracked with genuine fear. Without thinking, he pulled her into a paternal embrace, stroking her hair while murmuring reassurances. "William is strong," he said softly. "He'll be fine. You don't need to carry this worry alone." Catherine melted into his embrace, feeling a security and understanding she had rarely experienced even with her own father. Charles's presence made everything seem manageable again. In that moment, their relationship crossed another invisible line, from professional partnership to genuine emotional dependency. When William was released the following day, with nothing more than mild concussion, the family's relief was evident. But the crisis had revealed something important about the dynamics between Charles and Catherine. During the stressful hours of waiting and worrying, they had turned to each other for comfort in ways that bypassed their other relationships entirely. Camilla, who had joined them at the hospital, observed these interactions with a mixture of sadness and resignation. She could see that her husband and Catherine had developed a bond that excluded everyone else, including her. Their shared glances, unspoken understanding, and natural tendency to support each other revealed an intimacy that had grown far beyond appropriate boundaries. On the drive back to London, Camilla made a decision that would define the next phase of their story. Instead of fighting for her husband's attention or trying to compete with Catherine's place in his affections, she would begin the painful process of emotional withdrawal. She would remain his wife and queen consort in all official capacities, but she would protect herself by investing less of her emotional energy in their relationship. That night, as Charles enthusiastically recounted Catherine's strength during the crisis, Camilla listened politely while mentally beginning to rebuild the emotional walls she had lowered during their marriage. She would not make scenes or issue ultimatums, but she would no longer pretend that she held the primary place in her husband's heart. Charles, oblivious to his wife's internal struggle, fell asleep thinking about Catherine's gratitude for his support and making mental notes about how he could continue to be there for her in the future. He had found his purpose again, even if it came at a cost he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. December brought the first snow of winter, and with it, a noticeable change in Camilla's behavior that would reshape the entire household dynamic. She began implementing her decision to withdraw emotionally from Charles's daily life with a quiet determination that spoke to decades of experience navigating difficult royal situations. The transformation started subtly. Camilla began declining invitations to join Charles and Catherine for their working lunches, citing her own pressing commitments or simply saying she preferred to dine alone. When Charles suggested she join their planning sessions for upcoming charitable initiatives, she politely deferred, claiming these projects were more your area of expertise than mine. Charles, initially confused by his wife's sudden lack of interest in work they had previously shared, began accepting her explanations without question. After all, Catherine's enthusiasm for these projects more than compensated for Camilla's absence. If anything, Camilla's withdrawal made it easier for him to focus entirely on his collaboration with Catherine, without feeling guilty about excluding his wife. What Charles failed to recognize was the careful strategy behind Camilla's behavior. She had learned from years of royal experience that direct confrontation rarely achieved desired results. Instead, she chose to protect herself by gradually removing herself from situations that caused her pain, while maintaining her dignity and public composure. Catherine, meanwhile, remained unaware of the deeper implications of the increasing time she spent with Charles. She saw their partnership as a natural evolution of her role within the royal family, and Charles's growing trust in her judgment. If anything, she felt honored to be included so extensively in the king's most important work. During a particularly productive afternoon planning session for a new environmental education program, Catherine and Charles worked until well past dinner time. Their conversation flowed seamlessly from policy details to broader philosophical discussions about leadership and legacy. They shared a simple meal in his study, neither wanting to break the momentum of their collaboration. "You know," Charles said as they reviewed their final notes, "I haven't felt this optimistic about our work in years. You've helped me remember why these causes matter so much." Catherine smiled, genuinely moved by his gratitude and the obvious difference their partnership had made in his outlook. What neither of them noticed was Camilla passing by the study door on her way to her private sitting room. She glimpsed them through the partially open door, heads bent together over documents, sharing quiet laughter over some private joke, completely absorbed in each other's company. The scene would have been touching if it hadn't been so painful to witness. In her sitting room, Camilla poured herself a generous glass of wine and settled into her favorite chair with a book she had no intention of reading. The silence of her solitude felt both peaceful and profound lonesome. She thought about the early days of her relationship with Charles, when they had shared exactly this kind of intellectual and emotional intimacy. The irony wasn't lost on her that Catherine possessed many of the same qualities that had originally attracted Charles to Camilla herself. Both women were intelligent, compassionate, and genuinely committed to using their positions for positive change. The difference was that Catherine represented fresh possibilities, while Camilla had become associated with familiar routines. As December progressed, Camilla's withdrawal became more pronounced. She began taking longer trips to visit her children and grandchildren, often staying away from the palace for several days at a time. When friends inquired about her increased absence from Charles's side, she offered vague explanations about wanting to spend more time with family during the holiday season. During one such trip to see her son Tom and his family, Camilla found herself sitting in their comfortable country kitchen, watching her grandchildren play while her daughter-in-law prepared dinner. The domestic warmth of the scene contrasted sharply with the growing coldness she felt in her own marriage. "You seem different lately, Mum," Tom observed during a quiet moment. "More distant somehow. Is everything all right with you and Charles?" Camilla appreciated her son's perceptiveness, but wasn't ready to burden him with the complex reality of her situation. "Your stepfather is very busy with his royal duties," she replied carefully. "I'm simply trying to give him space to focus on what's most important to him." Tom sensed there was more to the story, but respected his mother's privacy enough not to press further. Back at the palace, Charles barely registered Camilla's extended absence. His days were filled with meetings and events that increasingly featured Catherine's presence and input. He had become so accustomed to her being his primary collaborator that he automatically consulted her on decisions that would have previously involved Camilla. The palace staff began to notice the shift in dynamics. Charles's private secretary found himself coordinating more meetings between the King and Princess of Wales than between the King and Queen Consort. The household staff observed that His Majesty seemed more relaxed and energetic when the princess was present, while maintaining a more formal demeanor during the Queen Consort's appearances. One evening in mid-December, as Charles reviewed his schedule for the following week, he realized that he hadn't had a substantial conversation with Camilla in several days. When he mentioned this to Catherine during their daily planning session, she looked surprised. "I hadn't noticed Camilla's absence," Catherine admitted. "I suppose I've been so focused on our projects that I haven't really thought about other family dynamics." For the first time, a small seed of concern began to grow in her mind about the implications of her close working relationship with Charles. That night, Charles made an effort to engage Camilla in conversation over dinner. He shared details about his recent activities and asked about her own commitments, but their exchange felt stilted and formal. Camilla responded politely, but without the warmth and engagement that had once characterized their private conversations. "You seem tired," Charles observed, noting the careful distance in his wife's responses. "Perhaps you should consider reducing your schedule for a while." Camilla almost laughed at the suggestion, given that her schedule had already been significantly reduced by her own choice. "I'm quite well, thank you," she replied simply, "just focused on different priorities these days." Charles accepted her explanation, missing entirely the deeper meaning behind her words. As December drew to a close, the pattern had become entrenched. Charles and Catherine had developed a professional and emotional partnership that consumed most of his attention and energy. Camilla had successfully created enough distance to protect herself from further hurt while maintaining the outward appearance of a functioning marriage. The annual Christmas preparations proceeded with their usual elaborate protocols, but the underlying family dynamics had fundamentally changed. Charles threw himself into planning holiday events with Catherine's input, while Camilla participated dutifully but without enthusiasm. Friends who had known the royal family for years began to notice subtle changes in their public appearances. Charles and Catherine seemed to share private jokes and understanding glances, while Camilla appeared more reserved and formal than usual. The shift was gradual enough that most observers attributed it to natural changes in family relationships over time. What no one fully understood was that Camilla's withdrawal into emotional solitude was becoming a permanent state rather than a temporary protective measure. She was slowly but deliberately building a life that didn't depend on her husband's attention or affection, finding meaning and purpose in relationships that offered genuine reciprocity rather than competition. January brought a harsh winter storm to London, and with it a crystallizing moment that would define the new normal for the royal family. Charles had planned an important meeting with international environmental leaders, and Catherine was scheduled to participate in presenting their new conservation initiative that they had developed together over the past months. The night before the meeting, Camilla received an invitation to join them for what Charles described as a family show of unity for this important cause. The invitation felt more like an obligation than a genuine request for her participation, and Camilla recognized it as such. She politely declined, citing a prior commitment to visit a local literacy program, a commitment she made immediately after declining Charles's invitation. Charles accepted her absence without question, perhaps even with relief. His focus had become so centered on his collaboration with Catherine that Camilla's presence now felt like an intrusion rather than support. The ease with which he adapted to her absence spoke volumes about how much their relationship had changed. The environmental meeting proved to be a significant success, largely due to the natural partnership Charles and Catherine had developed. They presented their ideas with a synchronicity that impressed the international delegates. Catherine's fresh perspective complemented Charles's decades of experience perfectly, creating a dynamic that was both professional and deeply personal. After the meeting, as they debriefed in Charles's study, both felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond professional achievement. They had created something meaningful together, and their collaboration had produced results that neither could have achieved alone. The intellectual and emotional satisfaction they found in each other's company had become essential to both their sense of purpose. "We make a good team," Catherine said simply as they reviewed the positive feedback from the delegates. Charles looked at her with an expression that combined gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that neither was ready to fully acknowledge. "More than good," Charles replied quietly. "I feel like we're finally making the kind of difference I've always hoped to make." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that extended far beyond their professional partnership. Meanwhile, Camilla spent the afternoon at the literacy program, working with children who were struggling to read. She found genuine joy in these simple interactions, where her presence was valued for the right reasons and where she could make a real difference without competing for attention or recognition. Mrs. Patterson, the program coordinator, mentioned how much the children looked forward to the Queen Consort's visits. "You have such a natural way with them," she said warmly. "They respond to you because they can tell you genuinely care about them as individuals." The comment touched Camilla deeply, reminding her of her own worth and value beyond her role as Charles's wife. That evening, the three adults moved through their separate routines like ships passing in the night. Charles worked late in his study, energized by the day's success and already planning future collaborations with Catherine. Catherine returned to her family, sharing the day's achievements with William while helping the children with their homework. Camilla retired early with a book, finding solace in the fictional world that demanded nothing from her but attention. Over the following weeks, this pattern solidified into their new normal. Charles and Catherine's professional partnership continued to deepen, with their shared commitment to various causes creating opportunities for frequent collaboration. They developed an unspoken understanding that went beyond words, often anticipating each other's thoughts and finishing each other's sentences during meetings. Palace observers noted that the king seemed more confident and decisive when working with the Princess of Wales than he had appeared in years. Their joint appearances at charitable events generated positive media coverage and seemed to energize both participants. Charles had found his ideal partner for the work he cared about most. Catherine, for her part, felt fulfilled in ways she hadn't expected when she first married into the royal family. Her partnership with Charles gave her a platform to address issues she cared deeply about and provided her with a mentor who understood the complexities of using royal influence effectively. She valued his experience and appreciated his trust in her judgment. What Catherine failed to fully recognize was how her increasing importance in Charles's life was affecting his relationship with Camilla. The Princess of Wales saw herself as a supportive daughter-in-law, helping with important family business, not as someone who had inadvertently replaced the queen consort in her husband's affections. Camilla, meanwhile, had begun to find a strange peace in her emotional independence. She threw herself into charitable work that didn't involve Charles, spending time with friends who knew nothing about royal protocol, and rediscovering interests she had neglected during the intense early years of her marriage to the king. One afternoon in late January, while Charles and Catherine were planning their next environmental initiative, Camilla sat in her private garden despite the winter cold. She had begun to appreciate the quiet solitude that her withdrawal had created. The constant anxiety about her place in Charles's heart had been replaced by a calm acceptance of their changed dynamic. Laura, her daughter, visited that weekend and immediately noticed the change in her mother's demeanor. "You seem more like yourself again," Laura observed over tea. "More settled somehow." Camilla smiled, recognizing the truth in her daughter's observation. "I suppose I've stopped trying to be someone I'm not," Camilla replied thoughtfully. "I've remembered that I have value independent of anyone else's attention or approval." The realization had been hard-won but genuine. As February approached, the royal household had settled into a rhythm that worked for everyone involved, even if it wasn't the configuration anyone had originally intended. Charles had found intellectual and emotional fulfillment through his partnership with Catherine. Catherine had discovered meaningful work that utilized her abilities and interests. Camilla had rediscovered her independence and personal strength. The marriage between Charles and Camilla continued to exist in official and social terms, but the emotional intimacy that had once defined their relationship had been quietly transferred elsewhere. They maintained respect and affection for each other, but the passionate connection that had sustained them through decades of obstacles had cooled into polite companionship. Neither Charles nor Camilla spoke directly about this transformation, both understanding instinctively that acknowledging it openly would require decisions none of them were prepared to make. Instead, they adapted to their new reality with the practiced grace that years of royal training had instilled in them. The palace staff, ever discreet, adjusted their routines to accommodate the new dynamics without comment. Private secretaries learned to schedule meetings according to the new preferences. Household staff became accustomed to the queen consort's increased time away and the king's regular collaboration with the Princess of Wales. From the outside, the royal family appeared to function as smoothly as ever, but inside the ancient walls of their various residences, three people had quietly rearranged their emotional lives in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to mirror the emotional changes within the royal family. By March, the new dynamics had become so natural that all three had almost forgotten how different things had been just a year earlier. The transformation was complete, but it had happened so gradually that none of them fully grasped the magnitude of what had changed. Charles woke each morning energized by the prospect of his daily collaboration with Catherine. Their partnership had evolved beyond professional necessity into something that gave meaning and purpose to his life in ways he hadn't experienced since his youth. When he looked back at his previous decades of royal duty, they seemed gray and mechanical compared to the vibrant sense of mission he now felt. Catherine, for her part, had grown into her role as Charles's closest advisor with a confidence that surprised everyone, including herself. She no longer saw herself as simply supporting royal causes. She had become a driving force behind initiatives that were making real differences in people's lives. Her partnership with Charles had revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The breakthrough moment came during a private conversation in late March, when Charles and Catherine were reviewing the remarkable success of their environmental education program. Schools across the country had embraced their curriculum, and early results showed genuine improvements in children's understanding of conservation issues. "You know," Charles said quietly, setting down his reading glasses and looking directly at Catherine, "I don't think I understood what real partnership felt like until we began working together." His words carried a weight that went far beyond professional appreciation. Catherine met his gaze steadily, recognizing the deeper meaning behind his statement. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "Working with you has taught me what it means to find someone who truly understands your vision and supports it completely." The moment hung between them, both acknowledging the profound connection they had developed without crossing inappropriate boundaries. That afternoon, in a moment of unusual introspection, Charles decided to take a solitary walk through the gardens of Windsor Castle. As he strolled among the early spring flowers, he reflected on the path that had brought him to this point. His relationship with Catherine had given him something he had searched for throughout his life: genuine understanding and shared purpose with someone who valued the same things he valued. For the first time, Charles allowed himself to fully acknowledge what had happened. He had found in Catherine not just a collaborator, but the intellectual and emotional companion he had always hoped to find. Their relationship remained entirely appropriate, but it had become the most important connection in his life. The realization should have troubled him more than it did. Instead, Charles felt a sense of peace about the situation. He was 75 years old, had waited decades to become king, and had finally found someone who shared his deepest convictions about service and duty. If that partnership had displaced other relationships in his life, perhaps that was simply the natural evolution of his priorities. Meanwhile, Camilla was experiencing her own moment of clarity. She had spent the morning at a women's shelter, listening to stories of survival and resilience that put her own situation into perspective. The work filled her with purpose and reminded her of her own strength and resilience. On her drive back to the palace, Camilla reflected on the past year's changes with surprising objectivity. She had lost her position as Charles's primary emotional companion, but she had gained something else: freedom from the constant need to compete for his attention and approval. The woman who had once fought for decades to marry the man she loved had discovered that love could exist in many forms, and not all of them required exclusive possession. That evening brought an unexpected conversation that would provide closure to their long transformation. Charles found Camilla in her private sitting room, reading by the fireplace with a contentment he hadn't seen in her for months. "You seem happy," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. There was genuine curiosity in his voice, as if he was seeing his wife clearly for the first time in months. Camilla looked up from her book and smiled with a warmth that surprised them both. "I am happy," she said simply. "I've remembered who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else needs me to be." Her words weren't accusatory, just honestly reflective. Charles studied her face, recognizing the truth in her statement. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know I've been distant lately, preoccupied with other things." It was as close as either of them would come to acknowledging what had really happened. "You've found your purpose again," Camilla replied gently. "Catherine helps you be the king you always wanted to be." "I understand that, Charles. I really do." Her acceptance was genuine, born from months of emotional work and self-discovery. They talked for over an hour that night, perhaps more honestly than they had communicated in years. Both acknowledged that their relationship had changed, but neither felt it was a tragedy. They had both grown and discovered new aspects of themselves through the process. "We're different people than we were when we married," Charles said as their conversation began to wind down. "Perhaps it's unrealistic to expect the same relationship to work for who we've become." Camilla nodded, feeling a liberation in finally speaking these truths aloud. "We can still love and respect each other without needing to be everything to each other," she said. "Maybe that's healthier than what we were trying to force before." As spring progressed into early summer, the royal family had found a new equilibrium that worked for everyone involved. Charles and Catherine continued their close collaboration, bringing energy and innovation to royal charitable work, that impressed observers worldwide. Their partnership had become the driving force behind some of the most successful royal initiatives in recent memory. Camilla had discovered a fulfilling, independent life that combined meaningful charitable work with genuine friendships and family relationships that nourished her spirit. She remained queen consort in all official capacities, but she no longer defined herself primarily through her relationship with Charles. Catherine maintained her role as both Charles's professional partner and William's wife with a grace that seemed effortless but reflected considerable emotional intelligence. She had become a central figure in the royal family's future, while respecting the complex relationships that surrounded her. The transformation had taken nearly a year, but it had resulted in a configuration that allowed all three to thrive in ways that might not have been possible under their previous dynamic. Charles had found his ideal working partner, Catherine had discovered her true calling within the royal family, and Camilla had rediscovered her individual strength and purpose. On a warm June evening, as Charles and Catherine worked late planning their next environmental summit, and Camilla enjoyed dinner with old friends in London, all three felt a sense of contentment that had been missing from their lives for longer than any of them had realized. They had learned that love and fulfillment could take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to become who they're meant to be. The royal family would continue to evolve, as families do, but they had found a way to honor both their duties and their authentic selves. In the end, perhaps that was the most royal achievement of all.